Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast, a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Emily Ferrier, here to bring you some uplifting stories in these trying times. For our first story, a video captures the stunning moment that a patient at a hospital in London played the violin while her surgeons removed a tumor from her brain. The unusual approach was taken to ensure areas of the patient's brain responsible for delicate hand movement and coordination, crucial components while playing the violin, were not inadvertently damaged during the millimeter-precise procedure. 53-year-old Dagmar Turner, a former management consultant from the Isle of Wight, was diagnosed in 2013 with grade 2 slow-growing glioma, after suffering a seizure during a symphony. The committed violinist, who plays in the Isle of Wight Symphony Orchestra and various choral societies, underwent biopsy and then radiotherapy at her local specialist hospital and kept the tumor at bay. When it became apparent in autumn of 2019 that the tumor had grown and become more aggressive, Turner, who has a 13-year-old son, was keen for surgery to remove it. A consultation was arranged with Professor Kiomers Ashkin, a highly recommended neurosurgeon at King's College Hospital, in order to discuss her options. Turner's tumor was located in the frontal lobe of her brain, close to an area that controls the fine movements of her left hand. Precise and skilled use of this hand is essential for playing the violin, as the fingers regulate the length of the strings by holding them against the fingerboard, producing different pitches. Turner explained her love of the violin and was aware of Professor Ashkin's mutual passion for music. The brain tumor specialist holds a degree in music and is an accomplished pianist. After explaining her concerns over potentially losing the ability to play the violin, Professor Ashkin and the neurosurgical team at King's devised a plan. Prior to Turner's operation, they spent 2 hours carefully mapping her brain out to identify areas that were active when she played the violin, and those responsible for controlling language and movement. They also discussed with Turner the idea of waking her mid-procedure so that she could play. This would ensure the surgeons did not damage any crucial areas to the brain that specifically moved when playing the instrument. With her agreement, the team of surgeons, anesthetists, and therapists went on to meticulously plan the procedure. During the operation, Professor Ashkin and the team performed a craniotomy, an opening of her skull, while Turner was brought round from anesthetic. As her tumor was removed, Turner played her violin while closely monitored by the therapist and the anesthetist. King's is one of the largest brain tumor centers in the UK. We perform around 400 tumor removals each year, which often involve rousing patients to carry out language tests, but This was the first time that I'd had a patient play an instrument, said Ashkin, following the procedure. We knew how important the violin was to Dagmar, so it was vital that we preserved her function in delicate areas of her brain that allowed her to play. We managed to remove 90% of the tumor, including the areas suspicious of aggressive activity, while retaining full function in her left hand. The violin is my passion. I've been playing since I was 10 years old, says Turner. The thought of losing my ability was heartbreaking, but being a musician himself, Professor Ashkin understood my concerns. He and the team at King's went out of their way to plan the operation. From mapping out my brain to planning the position that I needed to play in. And thanks to them, I'm hoping to be back with my orchestra very soon. 3 days after the procedure, Turner was well enough to go home to her husband and son, when she'll be continued to be monitored by her local hospital. This is a revolutionary thing to have somebody play an instrument during their procedure like that. And it's pretty incredible to have somebody be awake during the surgery, like doing something like that. And I just really loved that story, and I thought it was beautiful. And another interesting surgery story, Doug Lindsay, who just entered his senior year at Rockhurst University in Kansas City, Missouri, came home from his first day of class to be plunged into a real-life final project that took him 13 years to finish. The assignment? To find the origin and cure for a mysterious condition that had plagued the bodies of his family for generations and was now targeting him. He was 21 the day that the room began to spin around him, and he collapsed onto the dining room table in 1999. As a biology major, Lindsay had seen himself becoming a biochemistry professor, or, maybe something else, and he was a former school athlete, and he was set to finish the year and earn his degree. However, he'd always been deliberating a condition that sidelined him, and his mother and aunt in their early years would affect him too. When I called my mom that night, I told her I needed to drop out of college, and we both knew. His mother had gotten weaker until she couldn't pick him up when he was just 18 months old. By the time he was 4, she couldn't walk. She lived on for 4 decades, but she was too frail to do much beyond submitting years of tests that never confirmed any condition. Doug's mother suspected her weakness was related to her thyroid somehow, but the book that he wrote suggested adrenal gland problems can share the same symptoms with thyroid issues. So he then formed a bold hypothesis that there existed a new class of diseases of the nervous system still undiscovered by medicine. He knew he needed to find a doctor interested in pursuing new discoveries. He found that partner in Dr. H. Cecil Coughlin, a medical professor at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. He thought the young student might be onto something, so he helped Doug begin an IV protocol of noradrenaline to counter any excessive adrenaline in his glands that there might be producing. They continued on this bag of liquid for 6 years. But why was the body producing so much adrenaline in the first place? The doctor proposed the adrenal tuner might be the culprit, but 3 scans came up negative. Undeterred, Doug pored through the literature and came to believe that something else could be acting like a tumor, causing his glands to misbehave. 6 years later, a 4th scan showed his adrenals growing brightly. Coughlin called Lindsay and said, "We've found it." Now I want to finish this story, but we do need to take a short break. So we're going to see what the doctor Coughlin and what Lindsay found after this short break. So don't go anywhere.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about some incredible surgery stories, and we were in the middle of one of a young man who was bedridden and was working on solving his own medical mystery. And we had gotten to the Dr. Coughlin that was helping him, had just found his adrenals glowing. Bilateral adrenaline medullary hyperplasia was the diagnosis. The medulla is an interior region of the adrenal gland, and it had grown and enlarged, acting like a tumor, proving Lindsay's hunch. As experts in the field were still doubtful, Dr. Coughlin realized that they were in uncharted territory. Only 32 cases of the diagnosis were ever recorded, and there was no record of surgeries on humans to correct it. But there were studies done on dogs, cats, and mice. These described processes similar to slicing the end of the adrenal gland and squeezing until the medulla popped out like a pimple. With only the animals as evidence and vague descriptions of the surgery, Lindsay created a 363-page PDF detailing what the first human adrenal medullectomy would look like. Shopping for a surgeon proved difficult. It took 18 months, but Doug eventually found a surgeon at the same university in Birmingham who was willing to put their medical license on the line for an untested procedure. The doctor extracted one of Lindsay's medullas. The surgery was a success. 3 weeks later, Lindsay could sit up for 3 hours, and by the end of 3 months, on Christmas Eve, he walked a mile and attended church. The second was surgically removed a year later at Washington University in St. Louis, completing the procedure that Lindsay had invented at home in his computer. He says, "I can travel and give speeches and go for walks, and I can try to change the world." I loved that. I thought it was really incredible that this man had found a cure for himself. Yeah, that was really, really incredible to me. And something else incredible in the medical community. We're going to Canada now. A cozy little Canadian community may seem like an ordinary village on the outside, but actually it's the country's first village designed to accommodate people living with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. British Columbia community houses up to 78 patients in several dozen cottages, businesses, and shared living spaces. Shortly after the construction of the village, Elroy Jefferson, who created the village, he was the mastermind behind it, said that he wanted dementia patients to feel the same amount of independence as their able-bodied counterparts. He said, "We believe it's really important for people to be connected to nature and life in the outdoors." The village now gives a controlled space where they can live their lives free of stressful feeling of always running into a locked door. The residents are free to roam around the gardens, restaurants, and facilities of the village, and the community itself is protected by an 8-foot fence around the perimeter. Residents are also required to wear wellness bracelets, which use Bluetooth technology to keep track of their locations. The initiative draws inspiration from Hogewick, a similarly designed community in the Netherlands, which was declared the world's first village for dementia patients. Since the village opened back in August, it's already welcomed several dozen residents, and CBC says that there are similar initiatives now being implemented in South Vancouver. So even though they're a little bit less cost-effective than its counterparts in Netherlands, its management is now conducting research on the project's efficiency in hopes that it will eventually spur the government to help fund its operations and make a care model more affordable for the Canadian public. And just one more little story about some advancements that are helping people's lives. A startup uses virtual reality to help seniors re-engage with the world. Reed Hayes stood inside an assisted living facility, probably much like the one we just talked about, in front of an elderly man struggling with dementia, and he wasn't sure what to expect. The man was slouched in his wheelchair, unmoving, his eyes barely open. Hayes had enrolled at MIT's Sloan School of Management with the idea of helping older adults overcome depression and isolation through an immersive world of virtual reality. Now he needed to test his idea. Hayes turned on a virtual reality experience featuring 3-dimensional painting by Vincent van Gogh and a classical piano playing in the background. He placed the headset on the man. He just came alive, Hayes remembers. He started moving around, tapping his feet, laughing. All of a sudden, he was much more engaged in the world. All this from someone who was slouched over, now kind of bouncing around. My classmate Dennis and I looked at each other and said, "Holy cow, we might be onto something." It was remarkable. Hayes and Dennis saw the transformative impact of virtual reality many times after this. Their startup has since brought VR experiences to more than 100 senior living communities and have launched in hospitals to patients of all ages. Starting Rendeavor was the most important thing I've ever done in my life. It holds a special place in my heart, and it's probably the most material impact I'll ever have in my life. It's amazing to see them point things out to each other and engage with one another, yelling, "Look left," or "There's a puppy at our feet." Or if they're in Paris, some might say, "I was in Paris in 1955 and there was this cute cafe," and people start adding details and telling their own stories. That's where the magic happens. Once there was an older adult who kept saying, "I want to go home," but she was in an assisted living community and showing signs of dementia. With technology that we built, we were able to type in the address of her home and take her there. She started crying tears of joy, and she kept saying, "This is the most beautiful place in the world." Now the company is working to reproduce its clinical trials and the results that they've seen with individual clients. It's too early to say that VR improves symptoms related to aging, but it obviously does improve a quality of life. They've continued to use Rendeavor and continue communicating with old friends that they never thought that they'd hear from again. So those are some pretty incredible advancements that are improving the quality of life in various patients with various diseases throughout America and the world. And when we come back, we're going to talk about a lovely thank you message that American Firefighters received from Australians last week. That's when we return.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back. For the break, we are talking about medical advancements that are improving quality of life in patients with various diseases around the world in America. And now, rather than depicting an advertisement for food or clothing, this New York City billboard features a thank you message to the American firefighters who stepped up to help with the Australian bushfires. The 70-foot message, which is currently being displayed in Times Square, was designed by the NSW Rural Fire Service after all of their regional bushfires were finally declared contained last week. Imagine fighting a bushfire higher than this billboard, reads the video advertisement. After the billboard screen is briefly consumed by animated flames, the ad reads, "Thank you to the brave Australian and U.S. firefighters defending Australia and around the world for your support." The ad space was reportedly donated by Silvercast Media. The fire office published a video on the billboard message to Twitter this week saying, "We wanted to say a big thank you to all the firefighters who've worked so hard after the last few months and the community for its support." And when we say big, we mean big. 70 feet tall, in Times Square, New York. In addition, thousands of Australians are being heartened by these striking photos of greenery and plant life growing out of an area that was left charred and blackened by the bushfires last month. The pictures were taken by Australian photographer Murray Lowe in the Cynara area of the central coast of New South Wales. Ventured out on the grounds today to capture some images of how the Aussie bush responds to the fire and the way it regenerates itself and comes back to life, Lowe wrote in a Facebook post. Even without any rain, life bursts through the burnt blacken of the heart of the trees, and the life cycle begins again. It's so heartening to see the bush come back to life again. On Facebook, a user thanked Lowe for the photo, saying, "I think everyone is so happy to see your beautiful photos, showing us something positive after weeks of heartache. It gives us hope. Thank you for sharing these, Mr. Lowe. It's so nice after the tragedy to see growth in the bush." And these photos, since going live, have been shared over 39,000 times. And if that's not enough, here's a dozen different ways that the world has rallied behind Australia during the bushfires. Teams of Muslims from the Australian Islamic Centre began cooking meals for exhausted firefighters across East Gippsland. The group also distributed several truckloads worth of food, emergency supplies, and resources across the region. In the very same area, chefs from Sikh Volunteers Australia set up their own mobile kitchen so they could feed firefighters and bushfire evacuees. Canada and the United States have collectively deployed over 200 firefighters to combat the wildfires. As a means of helping animals be rescued from the firefighters, needle workers from around the world have had crafted thousands of mittens, sweaters, blankets, nests for Australian wildlife organizations, and have raised over $5 million in donations for wildlife hospitals. Furthermore, the family of Steve Irwin, who have already treated hundreds of animals, rescued from the wildfires at their home at the hospital in Queensland. A number of Hollywood A-listers and famous folk from all walks of life contributed to the wildfire relief efforts. An online fundraiser created by Australian comedian Celeste Barber raised $30 million in just 1 week, which is roughly $10,000 per minute. Australian actress Nicole Kidman made an Instagram post saying that she donated $500,000 to rural fire services, while pop star Pink donated an additional $500,000 to local firefighting departments as well. Australian tennis player Ashley Barty, who's ranked number 1 in the world in Singles Women's Tennis Association, has announced that if she wins Brisbane International Tournament, she'll be donating every cent of her $382,000 prize money to the Red Cross. The Australian children's entertainment group, The Wiggles, have reunited for the first time since 2012, so they can play 2 shows in New South Wales and donate all the concert proceeds to the wildfire relief. The concerts, which sold out in 5 minutes, took place on the 17th and 18th of January. And of course, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison pledged more than $1.4 billion in taxpayer money to create a national recovery fund for wildfire-affected citizens. While there have been dozens of individual stories of compassion and charity, these ones really proved that the world is standing behind Australia until the country has felt relief. It's very important to remember that even though the fires have been extinguished, thanks to the support and efforts of everyone from across the world, and of course our firefighters on the American front, there is still the relief. It doesn't end with the fires, so it's really nice to see that people have not forgotten that and continue to help Australia and rally behind them. And that there's people showing them the positivity coming out of it, and that they are healing, and it will get better. And after all of those months of devastating news from Australia, it is finished. The fires are finished, and we're moving on, and we're regenerating, and it's regrowing, and it is going to be okay. So I loved these stories. I thought they were really, really beautiful. So that's it for the stories coming from Australia, and the lovely thank you message that we received on a billboard in New York Times in return for the efforts. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about some tree planting efforts in Massachusetts that are aiming to regenerate a species of tree that had nearly become extinct in the American rural lands. So we're going to talk about that when we come back from our break. So stay tuned for that.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how the bushfire relief is going quite well, and Australia is healing from its tragedies. And now, for over a millennium, Western society has attempted to establish clear codes of ethics in business, politics, personal relationships, religion, and even warfare. But what about land use ethic? What does modern society have to say on the topics of ethics about our land? One small farm in Massachusetts, Jono Niger, is planting chestnut trees where he might have just planted corn row or crops. One staple crop of many Native American tribes, chestnuts provide more than just lyrical opportunities in Christmas songs. Like a keystone endangered species in the national park, towering trees can anchor the success of a revolutionary agricultural practice that uses the noblest of ethical codes regarding the humble farmer's acre. Niger is just one of a number of American and European farmers facing the environmental challenges of the 21st century by looking backward into the stewardship and land practices in the famed American conservationist Aldo Leopold, author of an essay called Land Ethic. A land ethic, he wrote in his magnus opus of the same name, will not only represent a step towards restoring North American chestnut ecosystems, but also plants the foundation for Niger, which is called a system of agroforestry, multi-story cropping, or permaculture on his farm. The nuts falling from their limbs will be one of his most critical crops, but only one of the many in what will be a cycle of regenerative agricultural practices that bring the field of the forest together, securing the food production of the former forest, to the environmental services of the latter. Trees fit well in many places where it's not suitable for agriculture. You use hillsides, where at any time regular monoculture agriculture occurs, causes lots of erosion and soil loss. Having trees in these places slows the erosion and start to rebuild the soil and sequesters more carbon, says Farmer Niger. In terms of producing food, his chestnuts are a great source of carbohydrate, like corn or wheat, only more nutrient dense, and growing higher up than down below. They were once very commonly grown into flour for baking bread, and they provide hogs and wild forest creatures with a predictable and bountiful food source. Opting against a traditional farmer's beige and yellow crop monopoly also frees up the forest floor for more diverse kinds of cash crops, as well as medicinal herbs and fungi. He waits for his chestnut trees to reach a necessary age and size, and chooses pawpaws, parmesans, and elderberries to grow to produce food. Furthermore, the ability to select wide variety of plants to grow in and around the chestnut tree aroused Niger and other multi-layer farmers to cultivate environments that can host a maximum number of both wild and domestic animal species. Niger released chickens onto the land, and rather than eating the corn and feed, the food they actually prefer, rodents, insects, and worms, as well as wild seeds and nuts, all of this turns their eggs into a natural color, rich in healthier fats and nutrients. This marriage of the canopy, cover crops, ground crops, and animals is what Niger and other multi-story farmers are looking to master. It allows them to produce varying amounts of a large variety of different food sources, while all at the same time sustaining the environmental services provided by the trees, like soil enrichment. Leopold summoned this concept in his book, Song of Gavilan. The oak, which feeds the buck, who feeds the cougar, who dies under the oak, and goes back into the acorns for his erstwhile prey. This is one of the many food cycles, starting from and returning to the oaks. For the oak also feeds the jay, who feeds the goshawk, who named your river, the bear, whose grease made your gravy, the quail, who taught you a lesson in botany, and the turkey, who daily gives you the slip. Today, agriculture is one of the largest contributors to a number of practices detrimental to the environment. Forest clearance, especially in countries with tropical rainforest, is often driven by agriculture, while resulting in water contamination, soil erosion, and loss of carbon-sequestering plants, wildlife habitat, and biodiversity from age-old methods of farming and ranching. Much of America's farmland and the crops which the U.S. government subsidizes consist of corn, wheat, rice, soy, or cotton, and these crops present very little nutritional value. However, all of these things that this farmer is making are making huge headway into not only making sustainable crops to continue our eco-friendly initiatives, but they're also helping all of the other living creatures within those cycles. So it's a pretty incredible thing that this farmer is doing. And he and many others are encouraging as many people as possible to try and meet the same initiatives and standards in America to keep us going on this lovely journey. And there's many ways that we can do it. And if you are a farmer, if you're wanting to do sustainable farming just on your own, for yourself, you can definitely look into Leopold's ideas. There's plenty more on this, but I don't quite have the time to finish it. So when we return, we're going to talk about some research at the University of Michigan into EpiPens. So we're going to talk a little bit about that when we come back from the break.
Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets podcast is for you.
Welcome back. When we left off, we were talking about some green initiatives that were helping sustainable farming. And now, calling it an EpiPen for trauma to the central nervous system, University of Michigan researchers have shown how injections of nanoparticles can prevent the body's immune system from overreacting to trauma, potentially preventing some spinal cord injuries from resulting in paralysis. This approach was demonstrated by mice by the scientists in Ann Arbor, when the nanoparticles enhanced by healing and reprogramming the aggressive immune cells. In this work, we demonstrate that instead of overcoming an immune response, we can co-opt the immune system and response to work for us to promote therapeutic responses, says Lonnie Shea, the Stephen A. Goldstein Collegiate Professor of Biomedical Engineering. Trauma of any kind kicks the body's immune response into gear. In a normal injury, immune cells infiltrate the damaged area and clear debris to initiate the regenerative process. The central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord, however, is normally walled off by the immune activity by the blood-brain barrier. But a spinal cord injury that breaks the barrier, letting in overzealous immune cells that create too much inflammation for the delicate neural tissues. This leads to rapid death of neurons, damage to the insulting sheaths rather than nerve fibers that allows them to send signals in the formation of a scar that blocks regeneration of the spinal cord's nerve cells. All of this contributes to the loss of function below the level of the injury. That spectrum includes everything from paralysis to a loss of sensation for many of the 12,000 new spinal injury patients every year in the United States. Previous attempts to offset complications from this immune response included in injecting steroids, and this practice has been largely discarded since it comes with side effects including sepsis, gastrointestinal bleeding, and blood clots. And the risks outweigh the benefits. But now, researchers have designed nanoparticles that intercept immune cells on their way to the spinal cord, redirecting them away from the injury. Those that reach the spinal cord have been altered to a more pro-regenerative. Hopefully, this technology could lead to a new therapeutic strategy, not only for patients with spinal cord injuries, but for those with various inflammatory diseases. With no drugs attached, the nanoparticles reprogram the immune systems with their physical characteristics, a size similar to cell debris with negative charge that facilitates binding to immune cells. In theory, their non-pharmaceutical nature avoids unwanted side effects. With fewer immune cells at the trauma location, there is less inflammation and tissue deterioration. Second immune cells that do not make it to the injury are less inflammatory and more suited to supporting tissues than growing back together. Hopefully, this technology could lead to new therapeutic strategies, not only for patients with spinal cord injury, but for those with other various inflammatory diseases, says Jung-Huk Park, a UM researcher working with Shea. Previous research has shown success for nanoparticles mitigating trauma caused by multiple sclerosis and the West Nile virus, for example. The immune system underlies autoimmune disease, cancer, trauma, regeneration, and nearly every major disease. Tools that can target immune cells and reprogram them to desired responses have numerous opportunities for treating or mangling disease. The research, published in a current issue of Proceedings from the National Academia of Sciences, was supporting the National Institute of Health. Shea is also the William and Valerie Hall Chair of Biomedical Engineering and a professor of chemical engineering. When devastation and trauma struck David Lawrence's perfectly healthy, happy family, the courageous father responded by making the impossible possible. At 11 years old, his son David Jr. underwent surgery in his brainstem to remove a life-threatening growth. After the procedure, the surgeons and doctors said that David Jr. would never walk again. Seeing his son paralyzed from the neck down and facing a life as a quadriplegic, David Sr. stayed by his son's side through months of intensive rehabilitation. Then, as the devoted dad was researching different therapies, David Sr. came across hyperbac oxygen treatment. Since David Sr. had been a scuba diver for many years, this therapy sparked his interest, so he began taking David Jr. to a local swimming pool for a new kind of workout. David Jr.'s response was amazing. The physical workout that David Sr. designed for his son helped to rewire his nervous system until over time he could be brought back to life by his once paralyzed body. David Sr. constantly reminded his son that he could do it, encouraging him to push through the pain and exhaustion and keep his goal in focus. 10 years later, David Jr. is now getting his PhD at university. He walks, runs, and works as a scuba instructor for his father's business, the Scuba Gym, in Claremont, California. David Jr.'s mom, Kim, has 2 younger sisters who jumped on board, and rehabilitation has become their family business. All it takes is desire and commitment to work hard. So we've taken our clients and their medical team and reached the limit of what traditional rehabilitation could offer them. It takes pioneers who think outside the box, or in our case, outside the wheelchair, to bring hope back to people who've been told that there is none. We challenge and change the way that healing and rehabilitation is approached, and combine that initiative thinking with a passion for scuba diving. Because an anti-gravity environment, where the restrictions of land don't apply, we can achieve incredible things. So these are huge, huge, huge advancements, and lots of hope for people that felt hopeless in their injuries and their conditions. And when we come back, good news on today's date in history when we return from our break.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration, We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. This was an episode of healing. We talked a lot about healing today and various medical initiatives that are making Americans' lives better. And now we're going to talk about some of the historical events on today's date in history that have been really great news over the past. So we just want to prove in this segment that good news is historically true as well. On today's date, 100 years ago, American Nancy Astor became the first woman to speak in the House of Commons in the United Kingdom following her election as a Member of Parliament 3 months earlier at age 41. Viscountess Astor was notable for bravery, moving to England at age 26 after divorcing an abusive alcoholic. She married an Englishman who was born in the U.S., Waldorf Astor, who eventually entered the House of Lords. The Woody woman entered politics herself, winning his former seat in Plymouth. Gaining attention as someone who did not follow the rules, she served in Parliament as a member of the Conservative Party for 25 years. While the couple enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, she used her wealth to support the expansion of nursery schools for children's education. In government, she fought to raise the legal drinking age for the public from 14 to 18 and worked to recruit women in the civil service, police force, education, and the House of Lords. Some more good news on today's date. Mexico declared its independence from Spain on today's date in 1821. The first floats were paraded in Mardi Gras in New Orleans, where today dozens of crew members, people that work all year round to plan the balls and parades, ride elaborate modern floats, tossing strands of beads into cheering crowds in 1868. Led Zeppelin released their 6th album, Physical Graffiti, in a double album that features songs left over from their previous Led Zeppelin 3rd and 4th and the Houses of the Holy in 1975. The United States Olympic hockey team completed the miracle on ice by defeating Finland 4-2 and winning the gold medal in 1980. And on today's date, in 1983, Congress released a report condemning the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II as a grave injustice. On today's date, in 1985, Thailand began its annual National Artist Day to celebrate and award benefits to honored artists on the birthday of Buddha, Loida Nabala, King Rama II, a poet and artist whose reign is known as the most peaceful time in Thailand's history and the golden age of Radicanism literature. in 1985 on today's date. Also on this date, in 2006, the European Space Agency agreed to provide over 100 million euro to launch Curiosat 2, a satellite that has measured and monitored the health of the land and sea ice worldwide since its launch in 2010. On this date, in 1944, Mirals Marauders began their 1,000-mile journey through Japanese-occupied Burma during World War II. A total of 2,750 Marauders entered Burma, and through their marksmanship and wit, they served Japanese supply lines in March. The men of Unit Galad enjoyed a rare distinction of having each soldier awarded the Bronze Star. The fighting unit, perhaps the most celebrated in World War II, after surviving at all odds, eventually was turned into the 75th Ranger Regiment. In slightly more than 5 months of combat, the unit itself had advanced 750 miles through some of the harshest jungle terrain in the world, fought major engagements in Wollongong, Shaziup, Ingantawang, Nimbunka, and Magatini, and engaged in combat with the Japanese on 32 separate occasions, including 2 conventional defensive battles for which it had not been intended nor equipped. Waging a constant companion against the Japanese hunger and disease, the unit had traversed more jungle terrain on its long-range mission than any other U.S. Army formation during World War II. On the 10th of August 1944, the surviving men were consolidated into the 475th Infantry, which continued its service in North Burma as a component of the division-sized Mars Task Force in 1945. So that was so they were given their distinction on today's date. So that is it for our history of today's date. So lots of interesting things happening there, and fascinatingly enough, it's interesting to see the contrast of the injustice of the Japanese Americans being treated in World War II versus the unit that was infiltrating Japan, as well as the celebration of Mardi Gras and all of these interesting things that have happened all over the world on the same date. I always find these really, really interesting, which is why I like to do those little things at the end, just to see all of the good news and interesting things that have happened over history in today's date. So thank you for listening today. Lots of stuff about medical advancements and wellness in America. Some really great things happening in those areas. So there is beauty in America, and I think we need to try harder to see it. So thank you for listening to the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review and rate the episode. That all really, really helps us. And please follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. And thank you again so much for listening. Try harder to see the beauty in America. Tell me when you do. And have a great night. I'll talk to you soon.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows. From the GSMC Podcast Network, from social media news to marketing news, and even weird news, the GSMC Podcast Network has you covered. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast.